In this lesson, we're going to learn about lighting mobility. Alright, so now that we've learned how to place lights, manipulate them, and then also look at their lighting properties, it's important that we know the difference between the different mobility modes. So with our point light selected, you'll see that we have three different modes of mobility. We have static, stationary, and movable. What this basically means is how expensive do you want this light to be? And also it's going to change the behavior of the shadows that this light emits. So, or this light casts, I should say. So let's start out with static. What does this mean to us and how is it going to be beneficial? Well, it's important to note that a static light cannot be changed or moved in any way during runtime. So whenever we're playing the game, we can't change its color, we can't change its position, or even the brightness. In fact, we can't even turn it on or off. And so that's how it's going to limit us with our lights. Now, that's not bad, because a lot of the lights that we put in, especially with this point light, are going to be used to create a very specific mood. It's going to help us colorize some of the materials and give us a better color palette in our level. So for this, it's a perfect example. We wanted it to appear a little bit more blue in the scene, and so we colorized it with this light blue color. Now we can bake that information into the light maps of our objects. Okay. Now we'll talk about making our lights here in just a minute. That's what this is talking about here. Now, the static lights are only calculated during the light baking process. So whenever I hit build lights right up here, it's going to calculate that and put that into the light map. After they've been built, they have zero impact on our performance. So that's a really good thing for us. However, because they're being baked into a map, they will not cast shadows on dynamic objects. So for example, if your character is running through a level and we run past this point light, this light will not cast shadows from our character. So it's going to look like our character doesn't have a shadow whatsoever. So that's some important things to remember. Okay, is there a possibility that the player could be moving through this? Do we want to cast a shadow from this light source? If not, let's just make it static, make it inexpensive. If they should, let's use a different option. Now we'll talk about those different options here in just a second. Now, whenever we're baking our lights, it's very important that we need to adjust the light map resolution of the objects. The light map resolution does not come from the light, okay? It comes from the object itself. So whenever a light is baked onto a surface and its shadows are baked onto a surface, it's going to depend on its light map property. So to access that, let's say this rock here, if we double click on it, or excuse me, double click on the static mesh in the properties, it's going to bring up the static mesh editor. With this object, we can scroll down to the light map resolution, which you can see right here. It's set to 32. That's a pretty good value for something like this. But if you happen to see that your shadows look very pixelated, you might bump that up to something like 64 or 128. Now 128 is a pretty high value for light map resolution on an object like this. So I think what we'll be able to do is 32, and we'll be able to get away with that just fine. But that is there, just in case you're wondering. Okay. So if you see any shadows that look very pixelated, they don't look really good, adjust that value. I'm going to go ahead and hit no on that because I don't want that to change. Let's go back to our point light. Let's select it. Okay, and let's talk about the stationary light. The stationary light gives us all of the functionality that we want out of our static lights. But the great thing about stationary lights is that it can change its intensity and its color at runtime. So let's say that we wanted to create a switch in our game that where we can turn a light on or we could turn it off. We could do that with a stationary light. We could even change the color based on that code. However, with stationary lights, we cannot change their position or rotation. Hence the name stationary light. Okay. Now, these changes will only affect the direct lighting. Okay. It will not affect the indirect lighting. So the direct lighting is the direct information that it pours onto a surface. So in this case, the brightness and the color that is on the surface itself. Indirect lighting is taking that information and bouncing it onto another surface. That information is going to be baked in, okay, and it will not be affected by a stationary object. Okay, so if you have a dynamic object in the scene, that's the only thing that's going to be affected. It's shadows and the light that's affecting that dynamic object. I'll show you that here in just a moment. Now finally, we have a movable light. And a movable light is fully dynamic. It's fully capable of adjusting any of its properties at runtime. Its position, its rotation, any of the properties that we see in our light section, that can be changed through runtime. However, it's very expensive, and it can be extremely expensive on very complex scenes. So if we have objects in the scene with a high amount of vertices, it has to calculate all of that, and it can slow your computer down quite a bit. So you want to be careful about using that. Now, movable lights cannot get baked. And so whenever we bake that information in, it's not going to bake in any indirect illumination or anything like that. So that's one of the drawbacks to that. So let's take this object and let's create a static light out of it. Okay, so we just want to bake this information in. To bake your lighting, you'll want to come up here to Build, select the arrow, and go to Build Lighting Only. You could go ahead and bake everything down if you wanted to, including all of the objects and everything, but we don't need to do that. It's just the lighting that needs to be built, hence this warning that we see here. Now at the bottom of your screen, you're going to notice Building Lighting, and it's going to give you a percentage on how long that's taking. And once that's 100% done, you should see lights built. Okay, so notice how it's changed our overall look to our level. We get that light that's being poured in from the indirect light that's being bounced into other surfaces, creating some very nice shadows. We also have our static light, which gives us this blue tint that is also baking in some of those shadows. Okay, very soft, ambient, occlusive shadows. And then it's also kind of bleeding some of that information onto other surfaces. Okay, now one thing that it's not going to do is it's not going to allow me to use dynamic shadows on that. So to see what that looks like, we would have to bring in a dynamic object. And I want to go ahead and show you how that's done. So we're going to talk about the stationary lights and the movable lights next. So I'll see you then.